In 1809, in a quiet parish near the Delaware marsh, a church scribe named Nathaniel Reed was sent to update the baptism book. He opened the storage chest, lifted folded linens, and found a plain leather ledger tied with faded cord. On the inside cover was a neat hand, Elias Harper and Miriam Harper, family accounts. Nathaniel turned the first page and saw what looked like private baptism records, each line ruled with care. 6 children were written beneath the Harper names. He paused, then frowned. Parish memory said the Harpers had only 3. He checked the church book, traced the column for Harper, and there they were: Ruth, Jonas, and Thomas. 3 entries, 3 candles held at the font. But the ledger offered 6, and the ink on half the names looked new, almost wet. As if someone had just finished writing and set the pages down to breathe. The room felt watchful, as if paper held its breath. He bent closer. The older lines were brown and cracked, the way iron gall darkens with years. The newer lines were sharp, blue-black, drawn with a fine nib. The dates were wrong, and the room felt smaller. 2 names were marked born last winter during the river freeze, yet Nathaniel had carried wood to the Harper house and heard no infant cry. He searched for burial notes and found none. No tiny coffins, no tolling bell, only silence where grief should have lived. Nathaniel knew the look of a hand that loves order. The script was disciplined, the spacing set like measured steps. Whoever wrote these names did not write with joy or haste. He wrote the way a man counts weights on a scale. The margins held marks that did not belong to money, small circles, numbers in a rising line, a cross with a second bar, and once 3 lines under a letter as if to pin it to the page. He touched one circle and felt a faint grit, as if the ink sat thick with something more than water. He turned more pages and saw that the family accounts were more than oats and cloth. Each false child's name appeared beside common goods and then beside things that did not make sense. Jars, birch bark, a short plank, a copper nail, lye. Miriam's name sat next to lengths of linen and thread counts. Elias's name sat next to the words night watch and hymn, night, underlined twice. At the bottom of one page, a very small hand had written the word kept. He pictured Elias at market, soft-spoken, quick to lift a barrel for a neighbor, and Miriam at her stall with quilts laid in patient rows. Their normal life had always felt safe, but normal is not proof, and the ledger told a different story, a quiet one written by someone who trusted paper more than people. Nathaniel felt a mind behind the lines that needed the world to match the book. If a name was written, a child would be counted, whether or not a breath had ever warmed the air. He copied the 6 names onto a loose sheet to compare them against parish books. The first 3 matched. The last 3 did not exist anywhere but here. He checked godparent lists, school rosters, and the burial pages. Nothing. He turned again to the ledger and found a note in the offerings column. Attendance, then a small bell mark. Next to it a tally of 6, and a plain word that shook him. Choir. A family account book had no reason to count voices. He had seen mistakes before and the scratch-outs that followed. This was not that. Each name was fixed like a nail, part of a private law. He lifted the book and smelled iron and a faint brine. A thumbprint shone on the paste down like a seal. He set both books side by side, wrote a note for the rector. Review Harper family. 6 claimed, 3 known, ink fresh. Outside, evening settled. Nathaniel locked the chest, blew out the candle, and walked toward the door facing the road to the Harper place, knowing the next page waited there. The Harper house stood alone at the edge of the Delaware marsh, whitewashed boards weathered but upright, its garden modest yet well kept, its door often open to neighbors passing by. From the road it looked ordinary, even comforting. the kind of place one would expect to find hymn books on the table and bread cooling on the sill. Investigators who visited decades later would describe it as a house that hid in plain sight, the kind that draws no suspicion until one looks too closely at what lingers around its edges. Behind the clean face of the walls, whispers ran through town about what drifted from the marsh at night. Children who played along the reeds claimed they smelled iron in the air, thick and metallic like nails left in water. Old men said the scent reminded them of wounds. Mothers pulled their children back when dusk fell, warning them not to linger too close to the Harper property when the fog rose low and gray. They spoke of strange fires in the barn, flickers that danced against the boards long after a workday should have ended. Faint bursts that looked less like lantern light and more like ritual flames, set and watched. Elias Harper himself never invited suspicion. He was soft-spoken, kind with his neighbors, generous with his time. When church rafters needed repair, he was the first to climb the ladder. When a widow required help with her fields, he appeared with his sons, quoting scripture as he worked. In town, he read from the Psalms, his voice steady and calm. No one ever saw him raise his voice in anger. No one ever heard cruelty cross his lips. His wife Miriam sold quilts in town and greeted buyers with gentle pride. Together they appeared a family shaped by piety and diligence. Yet their very normalcy made the rumors unsettling. For if Elias was good, then why did children whisper about screams carried by the wind across the marsh? Why did dogs refuse to go near the barn? Why, when parishioners visited late, did they see thin trails of smoke rising from the roof slats as though something was burning inside that should not burn? Those who passed close enough spoke of odd sounds, a rhythm, low and steady, that could be mistaken for a chant if one dared to pause and listen. Some claimed to hear a faint hum, almost like voices held inside carried on the breeze. The Harper garden looked innocent, rows of beans and squash, but neighbors noticed the soil was often turned at odd hours, mounds rising and settling in patterns that did not match planting. No one asked. Elias was trusted. Miriam was admired, and those who lived nearby learned to speak carefully, choosing silence over accusation because in a small parish, to doubt a godly man was to doubt the order of things. What investigators would later piece together was the chilling divide between the surface of the Harper life and what lay beneath. The house was whitewashed often, its boards scraped clean, but closer inspection revealed faint discolorations, streaks that resisted lime. The marsh behind it was known to bubble at strange times of year, water clouded with silt though no storm had passed. Barn walls bore burn marks on the inside, blackened yet scrubbed until only shadows of flame remained. To walk into the Harper home was to see the perfection of simplicity. A loom set neatly in the corner, linens folded with precision, scripture framed by candlelight. Yet it was precisely this order that made neighbors uneasy. Every item was arranged, every tool wiped clean, every floor swept until nothing human seemed to linger. People recalled that Elias spoke often of purity, of the world's stains and the need to keep one's house spotless before God. His words were admired in sermons. His hands were steady when he laid them on a neighbor's shoulder. But the house itself seemed too clean, as if every act of wiping and scrubbing was not for tidiness but for concealment. Investigators would later remark that the Harper home did not feel lived in. It felt maintained, staged, guarded like a book meant only for its author. A place ordinary on the outside, but ordinary to the point of unease, where every small sign of life, toys, clutter, wear, had been erased. The unsettling truth was that evil does not always wear the face of menace. Sometimes it stands in the pulpit, quoting scripture. Sometimes it opens its door with a smile and a loaf of bread. The Harper home was proof that horror thrives in the ordinary, hidden in the smell of iron that no one wanted to question, and the glow of flames no one dared approach. And though neighbors learned to quiet their doubts, the marsh never did. It carried the smell into their windows. It carried the whispers into their ears, reminding them that some houses stand apart not because they are cursed, but because they are tended by hands that use faith as cover for something unspeakable. The Harper home stood on the edge of the marsh not by chance, but by design. A boundary between what the town could bear to see and what it could not name. Miriam Harper was known in the parish for her needlework. Women admired the precision of her stitches, the way her quilts seemed to glow in candlelight as if they carried warmth even before they were used. She worked quietly, her head bent, hands quick, eyes never leaving the thread. Neighbors recalled that she rarely spoke while sewing, though she would hum hymns in a faint, almost tuneless way, as though the act of sewing itself was a prayer. The quilts were practical, large enough to cover a bed, yet arranged in careful squares and patterns that drew admiration at church fairs. To many, Miriam was a model of discipline, a wife who tended her house and children with care. Yet for those who looked closer, something about the quilts unsettled them. The patterns carried initials stitched into the corners, tiny letters embroidered with such neatness they seemed deliberate. At first, people assumed they marked family names. But when asked, Miriam never offered clear answers. She would only smile faintly and say the letters came to her in dreams. Years later, when the church ledger was opened and the names of phantom children were compared, the initials in her quilts matched those very entries. Neighbors remembered the letters they had seen stitched into colored squares, an EH that no one could place among the Harper children, an SR that belonged to no family in the parish, a JL that had no grave in the yard. Some had thought them practice stitches or perhaps initials of distant kin. But when investigators laid the quilts across the table decades later, each set of letters aligned with the names that never existed outside the ledger. The cloth became a second record, a hidden archive disguised as household work. What made the realization chilling was the care Miriam gave to each stitch. These were not idle marks, but deliberate acts of preservation, as if she had chosen to keep each phantom child alive through thread. The colors often differed, some squares bright, others pale and washed, but the initials never frayed, never lost their sharpness. It was as though Miriam sewed with more than needle and dye, as though she pressed memory into the fabric with her own will. Women who once admired her craft later said they remembered her eyes while she sewed, fixed, distant, almost reverent. Some recalled that she never let anyone handle a quilt before it was finished, guarding them as though they were sacred objects. There were rumors, too, soft ones passed from mother to daughter. Some said Miriam stitched in silence for hours without pause, her lips moving faintly as if reciting words. Others claimed her fingers never bled, though most women who sewed for long hours pricked themselves often. One girl remembered visiting to borrow thread and finding Miriam seated by lamplight, sewing a square of pure white, tears falling onto the cloth. When asked whose initials she was stitching, Miriam pressed the square to her chest and said only, "One of mine." The girl never forgot her voice, flat and certain, not grieving but claiming. The unsettling part was that none of the children marked in her quilts ever appeared in school rolls, nor were they buried in the churchyard. No markers bore their names, no small shoes were ever worn by them, yet they were remembered as carefully as living children. To Miriam, thread was enough. To her husband, ink was enough. Together they created a record of children who belonged only to them, not alive, not dead, but kept in objects that ordinary eyes would never question. Investigators who examined the quilts long after the Harpers were gone said they felt heavier than expected, as though the cloth held something more than wool and cotton. Some stitches were pulled so tightly the fabric puckered, as if anger or force guided the needle. In the right light, initials appeared not in simple thread, but in patterns that echoed scripture margins and symbols found later on bones from the marsh. Each quilt became not a blanket but a shrine. And though neighbors once wrapped themselves in Miriam's work, warming themselves through harsh winters, many would confess later that they never slept soundly beneath them. Some spoke of strange dreams. Children standing at the foot of their beds, silent, waiting. The same letters pressed into their chests. Miriam Harper's quiet needlework was praised as skill, but in truth it was something darker. Her quilts told stories that were never spoken aloud. They were her hidden gospel, her method of naming what should not exist, her way of keeping silence alive in fabric. And when the church ledger was finally laid beside the quilts, the truth was undeniable. The Harpers did not simply imagine children. They recorded them twice, once in ink, once in thread, binding them to the household forever. In 1810, Dover was a way station for those moving between farms, mills, and river towns. Strangers passed often, apprentices who had left their masters, farmhands between contracts, or children sent westward with no kin to claim them. For the most part, the town offered little welcome. Inns were few, barns closed their doors to outsiders, and suspicion kept travelers at arm's length. But one place was spoken of with warmth, the Harper household at the edge of the marsh. Elias Harper was known to open his door without hesitation, to offer bread, a place by the hearth, and a bed of straw in the loft. His wife Miriam would bring quilts, her hands folding them with quiet pride, while Elias read scripture in the soft voice that neighbors trusted. Many called his kindness rare in a hard land. But what began as a blessing soon became a shadow, for too many of those who entered his yard were never seen again. Stories circulated in Dover of apprentices who had been dismissed from their masters for small offenses. Boys barely into their teens, eager to earn again. Some were last seen walking along the road at dusk, their figures swallowed into the marsh fog, heading toward the whitewashed house with the warm lantern in the window. Orphaned children sent along by parish relief were entrusted into Elias's hands because he seemed steady, faithful, safe. Farmhands without contracts, desperate for work, were told they might find temporary shelter at the Harper place until harvest began. Yet records show that names once spoken on the road ceased to appear after their supposed welcome. No master reclaimed them. No family wrote letters asking of them. No farm later employed them. Their trails ended at the Harper yard. It was not unusual for wanderers to vanish in those days. Rivers claimed lives, thieves stalked the roads, and sickness cut down the strong without warning. But what unsettled the town was the pattern. The dates of disappearance aligned too neatly with the ledger Nathaniel Reed had uncovered. Names scribbled freshly on the Harper page bore initials identical to those Miriam stitched into cloth. Children no one had seen before, suddenly recorded as if born, bore the same names as the wayward apprentices or the orphans who passed through Dover. Their lives ended not in burial but in transformation, absorbed into the Harper family's private record, never again spoken of by those who should have remembered them. Neighbors admitted later that they had noticed the silence. They remembered Elias inviting travelers to join hymn nights, his barn lit warmly, the sound of youthful voices drifting faint through the marsh fog. They remembered seeing small figures at dusk following Elias toward the barn, carrying nothing but the clothes on their backs. And then, weeks later, those voices ceased. When asked, Elias would smile softly and say the boys had moved on, that they had found masters or kin further west. He would quote scripture about hospitality, about sheltering the stranger, and the neighbors, uneasy but unwilling to doubt, accepted his words. Few dared to question a man whose faith seemed so unwavering, whose prayers seemed so pure. But the ledger told otherwise. Each traveler became a child written into the Harper line, as though hospitality had been less an act of mercy than an act of acquisition. Investigators much later would call it methodical, Elias choosing those whose absence would not stir search parties or bring lawmen to his door. Apprentices shamed by dismissal, orphans with no blood to ask, farmhands nameless beyond a season. They were the perfect sacrifices, erased from the world with no ripple but their initials preserved in ink and thread. The chilling realization was that Elias's kindness had been a mask. Hospitality was his snare. The warm lantern in the Harper window became the lure that drew the desperate into silence. For every loaf shared and every quilt laid across thin shoulders, there was a space waiting in the ledger. And each time a child or wanderer stepped into that house, a new entry appeared. A name that would exist nowhere else but in the Harper's keeping. By the time neighbors pieced together the pattern, the trail was already cold. No graves had been dug, no farewells spoken. Only absence remained, and the faint memory of travelers last seen stepping into a yard that promised shelter but delivered only silence. The ledger filled its pages with the forgotten, and Dover learned too late that not all who offer bread and scripture mean to keep the living fed. Some keep only the memory of their guests, binding them in pages and cloth, ensuring that their bodies vanish while their names remain forever claimed. Decades after the Harpers vanished from memory, when the parish fields were parceled and the marsh drained for farmland, the truth began to surface. Laborers digging foundations near the old Harper property struck wood, not soil. At first they believed it to be a collapsed shed, but as the ground gave way, they unearthed barrels. Thick staves bound with rusted iron hoops. Sealed so tightly, the earth around them had hardened like stone. The men pried them open with iron bars, and what spilled out was not grain nor cider, but silence broken by horror. Inside each barrel were bones, upright, fused into postures that defied nature. Spines curved unnaturally, ribs arched outward as though frozen mid-scream. These were not burials meant for peace. They were displays meant for permanence. Forensic study, crude by the standards of the early century but methodical nonetheless, revealed a practice no one wished to describe aloud. The bodies had been bound upright, lashed to planks with rope, their arms drawn against their sides so tightly the cords left grooves in bone. They had been lowered into barrels partly filled with brine and quicklime. The combination slowed decay but warped the flesh until bone and ligament fused in rigid curves. What should have turned to dust became statues of agony preserved by chemical cruelty. Quicklime etched itself into vertebrae, carving deep scars that looked deliberate. Some barrels held children so small the bindings seemed more like cages than restraints. Their bones, still delicate, had stiffened into twisted arcs, ribs locked as though clawing for breath that never came. The barrels were not uniform. Some were oak, others pine, but all bore marks carved faintly on the inside lids. Crosses, circles, symbols that parish elders recognized from the Harper ledger margins. Each barrel seemed to be numbered, a sequence that stretched across the property. It became clear that this was not random killing, but a system. Each victim was assigned a place, a mark, and a method. And what struck investigators most was not only the cruelty but the precision. The barrels were arranged underground in neat rows, aligned with the edges of the marsh. Some whispered that the placement matched hymn stanzas, as though Elias had created a choir beneath the earth, each barrel a voice fixed forever in silence. On several skeletons, investigators discovered something more disturbing. Carved directly into the ribs were shallow incisions, crude yet purposeful. The cuts formed initials, sequences of letters and numbers. One bore a symbol like a psalm verse marker. Another bore 3 lines slashed beneath a rib, identical to the marks Nathaniel Reed had once seen in the ledger. It was as if the Harpers had turned human bodies into parchment, carving their records not only in ink and thread but into bone itself. The act spoke of a mind that needed permanence, that could not trust paper alone. To Elias and Miriam, a child was not real until it was recorded 3 times, once in ink, once in cloth, and once in the body that bore its mark. Neighbors who heard of the findings refused to speak of them in public. Some said it was too wicked to name, that such cruelty should remain buried. Others whispered that speaking it aloud gave it power, that Elias had intended for his method to be remembered, and silence was the only defense. But silence had always been the Harper way, and silence had been what allowed their work to continue for so many years. The horror lay not only in the method, but in its concealment. No one had seen the barrels rolled into the earth. No one had asked about the smoke rising from the barn. No one had counted the missing children whose initials, now cut into ribs, told the truth. What lingered most was the image of those twisted spines, preserved as though Elias meant for them to be statues, proof of dominion over the most fragile lives. These were not burials made in haste. They were creations, deliberate, ritualistic, rehearsed again and again until the sequence was perfect. The Harpers had built a gallery beneath the soil, 1 barrel at a time, where children and wanderers were transformed into artifacts of suffering. Even decades later, when the barrels were pulled from the earth, their shapes held the imprint of screams that had never been heard. The parish tried to bury the story, but the method could not be erased. It stood as a reminder that some evils are not content with killing. Some require preservation, a legacy of pain written into bone. And in the shadows of the marsh, the Harper barrels whispered that cruelty, when given order and ritual, can outlive its makers, turning silence into monuments of horror. The Harpers were often praised for their devotion to music. Townsfolk recalled that Elias would gather neighbors in the church, his voice carrying steady through the psalms, Miriam standing quietly behind him. Their own children sang with unusual clarity, voices so pure they were admired during Sunday services, and many remarked how angelic they sounded, as if touched by grace. But long after, when testimonies were collected and the barn searched, a different picture emerged, one that revealed what the Harpers had truly built behind closed doors. Survivors described nights when Elias invited children to his barn for what he called singing hours. He told parents he was teaching them hymns, offering guidance and scripture through music. Families trusted him. They let their sons and daughters walk the marsh path, believing they were safe beneath the hand of a godly man. What those children endured, however, was not worship but torment disguised as devotion. When the barn was opened by authorities decades later, its rafters still smelled faintly of smoke and salt. Among the tools, investigators found rows of wooden masks, hand-carved, each fitted with hollow mouths. At first glance, they resembled simple theater props, but closer inspection revealed the inside of each mouth was lined with tiny metal pins, angled upward like thorns. To wear one meant to bleed the moment a song was raised. The masks were small, shaped for children, and their insides bore stains that time had not erased. Some masks had cracks along the edges where teeth had bitten down in pain. Others had straps stiff with what could only be dried blood. Testimonies from those who survived spoke of Elias demanding song as sacrifice. He would line the children against the barn wall, fasten the masks to their faces, and strike his tuning fork until the air hummed. Then he would command them to sing, not softly but loudly, the hymns of purity and redemption. their voices muffled and torn by the pins carried through the marsh like a strange, beautiful suffering. Those who could not sing loudly enough were forced to continue until their throats cracked and their breath rattled like broken reeds. Elias told them that each note was a step closer to God, that their pain was proof of obedience. The children learned quickly that silence meant punishment, and so they sang through blood and tears until the hymn ended. It explained what neighbors had long remembered: the sound of distant voices floating through the night fog, eerie and haunting, yet strangely beautiful. Many thought the Harpers simply trained their children well, raising them with music and scripture. They marveled at the discipline of the Harper choir, how young their voices were and how steady their notes. No one questioned why the singing always came from the barn and never from the house. No one asked why the Harper children never laughed when they sang in public, why their voices seemed too rehearsed, too sharp with control. The barn masks revealed the truth. The angelic voices were forged through cruelty. The Harper children were not blessed with unusual talent. They were shaped by a father who demanded perfection through torment and a mother who stitched their silence into cloth. The voices admired in town were echoes of nights when hymnals were sung not in joy but in blood. For investigators, the masks became symbols of something more sinister than killing. They showed a mind that believed beauty required pain, that the sound of devotion could only be pure if it was wrung from suffering. To Elias Harper, music was not worship but control, a way to mold voices into instruments that carried his vision of order. Every note was a wound, every harmony a mark of domination. The choir of empty mouths, as locals came to call it, haunted Dover long after the barn was gone. The masks were stored in evidence, but whispers lingered. People remembered the strange hymns they had heard and realized too late what they truly meant. The Harper children's voices, once praised as angelic, were nothing more than the echoes of torment, the sound of obedience carved into flesh. And in that realization lay the cruelest truth. Beauty can hide horror, and admiration can blind entire towns to the suffering that builds the songs they love. The ledger did not remain static. What began as a modest family record, the kind any household might keep to track baptisms and offerings, slowly transformed into something else entirely. Each year brought new names written in Elias Harper's careful hand, and with each entry the script itself grew more elaborate, as though the act of writing had become a ritual. The early entries were plain, brown ink on lined paper, but the later ones swelled with flourishes. The letters looped and crowned with ornaments, as if the children he created on the page were meant not merely to be remembered, but to be exalted. Parish scribes who examined it long afterward said the handwriting no longer looked like ordinary accounting. It resembled liturgy, the kind of ornate script one might see in illuminated psalters, too grand for a household ledger, too careful for names that never belonged to living children. What disturbed them most was not only the style, but the dates. Some entries bore years that had not yet come when they were written, as though Elias had marked the future before it arrived. A child's name might be given a birth date in 1812, though the ink could be proven older, dried, and cracked long before the year itself. And when that year did arrive, when neighbors whispered about a missing boy from a farmstead, or a girl lost along the river path, the ledger page already held their replacement. Their absence in the world was balanced by their presence in the Harper book, their existence stolen and translated into ink. Each supposed birthday in the ledger aligned with the disappearance of someone real, someone who had once been seen walking in the fields, laughing in schoolyards, or gathering kindling in the woods. As the years passed, the ledger became heavier with these phantom births. The pages no longer served as mere records, they became a kind of prophecy. Elias shaping the future by writing it first, then seeking the bodies to match. He no longer waited for chance wanderers. He prepared. He wrote a name, an age, and a date, and then he set his sights on the child who would fulfill it. To the Harpers, it was not murder, but fulfillment, the act of bringing the book into alignment with the world. Ink dictated flesh, and flesh was forced to obey. Investigators later noticed how the entries followed patterns, as though arranged like verses of a hymn. Names appeared in clusters separated by small symbols. A circle, a cross, 3 slashes beneath a letter. The spacing itself suggested rhythm. One scholar described it as a psalm made of names, a structure not meant to be read aloud but to be recited silently, a private choir on paper. Miriam's role was woven into it too. For every time Elias added a name, a quilt square appeared in her work, stitched with the same initials. Together they created a double record, ink on paper, thread on cloth. Each record reinforced the other, each an affirmation that the child existed, even if only in the Harper imagination. The ledger also revealed Elias's obsession with permanence. He recopied certain entries, layering fresh ink over faded strokes as though refusing to allow the memory to dim. In places, the paper tore from repeated writing, yet the names were pressed again and again until the parchment became fragile as skin. Some pages were patched with scraps of linen glued inside, initials stitched onto them before the paper was bound back into the book. The result was grotesque. Part ledger, part quilt, a merging of Miriam's fabric rituals with Elias's scriptural ones. Neighbors who later learned of this remembered that Elias always carried the ledger with him to church meetings, tucked neatly beneath his arm as though it were a Bible. They thought nothing of it then, assuming he used it to tally tithes or keep notes for scripture. In truth, he was carrying his creation with him, his book of false children, his silent congregation. And when he bowed his head in prayer, perhaps he was not speaking to God at all, but to the names in his own hand, the ones he had promised permanence through ink. The chilling realization that came with the ledger's growth was that Elias had shifted from opportunistic predator to orchestrator. He was no longer recording what happened. He was directing what must happen, writing children into existence and then bending reality until they vanished from the world and reappeared only in his book. It was not simply murder, but authorship, a belief that the written word held power over life and death. And each year, as more names appeared, the ledger ceased to be a household record. It became a scripture of absence, a gospel of silence, binding the marsh to its pages, commanding that no child vanish without first being written into the Harper family's eternal choir. Miriam Harper had long been remembered as quiet, her voice rarely raised above a whisper, her words often hidden behind her husband's scripture. But when her letters surfaced years later, tucked into trunks and folded into quilt linings, they revealed that her silence had never been the absence of thought. It was agreement, complicity. At times, it was leadership. She wrote of Elias with devotion, describing him as guided by the hand of God, a man whose work was not of cruelty but of calling. To her, he was not a murderer. He was a shepherd preserving purity, and she cast herself as his faithful steward. The letters were neat, written with the same tidy hand she used for stitching, but their contents unsettled every reader who touched them. She wrote of her role in what she called keeping order, which meant cleaning the smallest bones after Elias had finished his rituals. Miriam described washing them in basins of lye water until they gleamed pale, then drying them by firelight. She called them keepsakes, treasures that must not be allowed to fade, and she confessed to arranging them into small cabinets Elias had built for her. To Miriam, they were not remains of children but tokens of eternity, fragile proofs that their silence could be held in place forever. Her words did not betray horror. They revealed pride. She compared the cabinets to reliquaries, sacred boxes where saints' fragments were kept, claiming that in their home, holiness had been preserved in bone. Even more chilling were her descriptions of the linens she prepared. Miriam embroidered wrappings for each body, psalms stitched into the fabric with her steady hand. She chose verses about silence, obedience, purity, and rest, weaving them into cloth that would later be wound around the dead. She wrote that doing so made their silence eternal, a phrase she used again and again, as if the act of sewing scripture into fabric sealed not only the body but the voice of the victim, ensuring no cry would rise against them in eternity. Her language was ritualistic yet calm, stripped of doubt. She believed she was sanctifying, not destroying. The town had once seen her as a model of meekness, a wife quietly serving her husband. The letters shattered that image. She was no passive accomplice. She was the keeper of remains, the curator of silence. In one letter, she wrote of a quilt square stitched with a name no one recognized, explaining that the thread carried more permanence than stone because fabric could be folded into other fabric, hidden, and carried forward without end. She believed her work would survive where graves could be lost and ledgers destroyed. To Miriam, the children taken by her family were not erased. They were bound to her household forever, their silence woven into the very fabric of daily life. What unsettled investigators most was her tone. There was no grief, no hesitation, no sense that she was recording something dreadful. She wrote with the simplicity of a woman describing household chores, the washing of cloth, the mending of seams, the preservation of bones. Her words were almost tender, but the tenderness was twisted, a devotion not to the children but to the permanence of their absence. She saw herself not as criminal but as custodian, ensuring that the names Elias wrote and the bodies Elias claimed would never be forgotten. In this way, Miriam's silence was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of ritual. She did not resist, she did not plead, she did not hide from the truth of what they did. She embraced it, wrapping it in cloth and thread until no one could separate her from it. And in those letters, the quiet woman once admired for her quilts revealed herself to be something darker, not the shadow behind Elias, but his equal. A voice that never shouted yet still commanded, ensuring that silence itself became their inheritance. In the winter of 1814, Dover was blanketed in a snow so heavy it bent the roofs of barns and froze the marsh into a sheet of glass. Smoke was common in such cold, rising from every chimney, but on a night in January, the glow above the Harper property was brighter than the rest. Neighbors saw the flames leap from the slats of the Harper barn, orange against the white drifts, and rushed across the frozen ground to help. By the time they arrived, the fire had eaten halfway through the roof. Elias and Miriam stood outside in the snow, faces calm, hands clasped as if in prayer. They made no move to fetch water, no shouts for aid. It was the neighbors who carried buckets from the well, their breath ragged, their clothes freezing to their backs, determined to keep the blaze from spreading to the house. When the flames were finally beaten down to embers, the rescuers stepped into the blackened shell. What they found was not cider barrels, not grain stores, not tools saved for spring. Dozens of barrels had cracked open in the heat, their staves split, their iron hoops melted into warped circles. Inside they saw shapes that stopped them cold, fused bones charred black, arranged not in piles but upright as though bound to planks. Limbs twisted together, ribs locked in grotesque arches. Skulls collapsed against each other like figures bent in prayer. The fire had destroyed flesh but revealed structure, and what emerged was a gallery of the dead, preserved in agony. Some barrels had burst, spilling bones across the floor, their forms still tangled as though hands had clutched each other in the final moment. Others had held so tight they became statues of ash, vertebrae fused in curves no natural death could produce. The rescuers staggered back, some dropping to their knees. They knew what bones looked like: livestock, hunters' kills. But these were human, unmistakable. Small, fragile in some places, larger in others, all bound in ways that spoke not of burial but of ritual. No one spoke at first, the silence heavier than the smoke. One man began to retch in the snow, another crossed himself over and over. The Harper children stood at a distance, their faces unreadable, as if they had seen the shapes before. Elias finally broke the silence, telling the crowd that the barrels had been filled with cider, that the fire had warped wood and iron until it mimicked bones. His voice was calm, almost gentle. He quoted scripture about temptation and trial, insisting that appearances deceive. Miriam nodded beside him, clutching a quilt around her shoulders. But the townsfolk had already seen too much. Some barrels still held symbols carved into the lids, marks that did not burn away. Circles, crosses, and slashes that matched the ledger entries. The sequence was undeniable, and when one charred ribcage was lifted, initials could still be read in shallow cuts across the bone, untouched by fire. The Harpers' claim of cider could not wash that away, yet the townspeople hesitated. To name what they had seen was to unravel everything they had believed about the Harper family, about faith, about trust. To accuse meant dragging the community into scandal and admitting that evil had been allowed to grow in their own marsh without resistance. That night, the rescuers left shaken, whispering to each other that perhaps what they saw had been tricks of the fire, illusions born of heat and smoke. They let Elias's explanation stand, if only to preserve their own sense of safety. But whispers spread. Some said the fire had been no accident, that Elias had set it to cover his tracks, burning the evidence before anyone could pry deeper. Others claimed the fire was divine, a punishment sent to reveal what had been hidden. Whatever the cause, the barn stood in ruins, and beneath its ash were bones no one dared bury or claim. They remained scattered in the blackened timbers, watched over by a family who never flinched at the sight of them. In the days that followed, the Harpers continued their lives as though nothing had changed. Elias walked to town with his ledger under his arm. Miriam sold quilts stitched with strange new initials, and their children sang in church with voices clear as glass. But those who had entered the barn never forgot the sight of limbs knotted together, of spines fused upright, of faces locked in eternal silence. They carried the memory like a wound, though most refused to speak of it. The official word became that cider had spoiled, that barrels had collapsed, that the fire had revealed nothing more. Yet in the private corners of homes, in the low murmurs before sleep, people admitted the truth to each other. The Harper barn had been a chamber of the dead, and the fire had not destroyed the secret. It had only made it visible. The fire forced Dover to face what it had long whispered about. In the weeks after the barn collapsed into black ash, constables gathered the courage to arrest Elias and Miriam Harper. They were taken quietly, without resistance, Elias carrying his ledger under his arm even as iron cuffs closed around his wrists. Miriam clutched a folded quilt, her face pale but serene. The town watched in silence as they were led away, and though no one raised a hand to stop the constables, few stepped forward to offer testimony willingly. To accuse the Harpers outright was to admit the parish had been blind for years. At trial, witnesses spoke in halting voices of children who had gone missing, of travelers last seen stepping into the Harper yard, of hymns carried on the marsh wind at night. Mothers testified they had seen initials stitched into quilts that matched no living child. Farmers described the strange smell of iron and smoke drifting from the barn. Even the rescuers who had pulled charred bones from barrels stood before the court, describing what they had seen with eyes wide, hands trembling. But when pressed to swear that those remains belonged to named children, they faltered. The bodies had burned, the records were thin, and fear clung to every word. Elias sat calm through it all, quoting scripture when aloud, his voice steady, his demeanor almost saintly. Miriam remained silent, her hands folded as though in prayer, never once betraying fear. Their very composure unsettled the room. Neighbors who had once praised their generosity now found it hard to believe that such soft-spoken people could have orchestrated such horrors. And in that disbelief lay the seed of doubt that poisoned the proceedings. The jury wrestled with the evidence, torn between the horror of what was described and the lack of bodies to anchor it. No child was formally identified. No family could point to a set of remains and claim them as their own. And hovering over the trial was the unspoken fear that convicting Elias and Miriam would implicate the whole town. For who had looked away? Who had sent children to their barn? Who had trusted their hymns? To condemn the Harpers was to condemn themselves. After weeks of deliberation, the jury deadlocked. Half demanded conviction, half clung to doubt. With no verdict reached, the court released Elias and Miriam after 6 months' confinement. Their ledger, taken as evidence, was sealed in the archives, locked away where no parishioner could ever see it again. The Harpers returned to their home as if nothing had changed, their reputation bruised but intact. And in Dover, the silence deepened. The trial that should have ended their reign of terror had instead strengthened it, proving that even in the face of testimony and bones, ordinary evil could survive so long as fear and respect kept its secrets. When Elias and Miriam Harper walked free, the town told itself the nightmare was over. 6 months in confinement had left them diminished, people said, and surely their reputation was too tarnished for them to act as before. But within a year, the disappearances began again, and this time they struck closer to home. The wanderers and orphans of years past had been easy to overlook, their absence explained away by the dangers of the road. Now it was the parish's own children who vanished, younger and more visible. Taken directly from their farms during storms when families huddled indoors, powerless to see who moved through the dark. It began with a boy of 6, missing after a night of lightning and rain. His mother swore she heard singing on the wind, faint but steady, though no hymn could have traveled that far in such weather. Weeks later, a girl of 8 disappeared from her bed, her window open though the shutters had been barred. Neighbors whispered that on both nights the Harper barn had glowed faintly, as though lit from within despite the storm. Each loss tightened the knot of fear, yet no proof tied the vanishings directly to the Harpers. Families searched the marsh, called out until their throats cracked, but no voices returned. Survivors spoke later of a sound that still haunted them. A low harmony carried through the fog, unlike ordinary singing, almost mechanical in its rhythm. Some said it was the sound of children forced to sing as they had before, their voices cracked with strain yet woven together in eerie unity. Others swore the voices were not earthly at all, but echoes Elias had conjured from those already gone, gathering them into what he called a choir that could not die. The ledger, though sealed in archives, still seemed to grow in rumor. Each new disappearance assumed to have been written there long before the storm took the child. The Harpers themselves walked through town as they always had. Elias calm and generous, Miriam quiet and unshaken. If questioned, Elias would speak of God's will, reminding his neighbors that life was fleeting and storms claimed whom they pleased. Few dared to push further for fear of what answers they might hear. The memory of the trial hung heavy. No one wanted to endure again the shame of accusing without proof. Yet in every farmhouse, candles burned longer at night, shutters were barred tighter, and prayers rose with desperation. Parents told their children not to wander the marsh paths, not to glance toward the Harper house, not to sing after dark. Still, the disappearances continued. Each storm another verse in a song that seemed endless. Some claimed they saw small figures moving across the fields, led by lantern light into the fog, their footsteps too quiet to be heard. Others swore the wind itself carried voices, as if the marsh had learned to sing. The sense grew that Elias and Miriam were not merely taking children, but weaving them into something larger, a congregation beyond death, a choir bound in silence yet eternal in sound. And though no evidence was found and no bodies uncovered, the terror of those nights left a mark no verdict could erase. The Harpers were no longer seen as neighbors, but as keepers of a secret choir, one that drew its voices from the living and the lost alike. In Dover, storms no longer meant only rain and thunder. They meant absence. They meant song. And with each child gone, the silence left behind grew heavier, as though the whole parish was being hollowed out, one voice at a time. In 1827, years after the Harpers had vanished from Dover and left only whispers in their wake, the old schoolhouse they had once funded was scheduled for demolition. The building had stood crooked for years, its beams warped by damp air, its roof sagging under the weight of storms. When workers began pulling up the floorboards, they uncovered more than rot. Beneath the foundation lay a pit, carefully dug and lined with stone. Inside, arranged with deliberate order, were tiny wooden chairs, no taller than a child's knee. Each chair faced inward, forming a perfect circle. Resting on every seat was a jawbone, small and delicate, placed as though each had once belonged to a child given their seat in some eternal gathering. The workers froze at the sight, the silence in the pit so heavy it seemed to press against their chests. Some chairs bore burn marks, others were painted faintly with symbols that echoed the margins of the Harper ledger. The arrangement was not random. It mirrored quilt patterns Miriam Harper had once sewn, squares aligned into circles, initials hidden in fabric. The discovery tied her work to this hidden grave, binding thread and bone together in a final design. It was clear the schoolhouse had not been built simply as an act of charity. It had been constructed atop a shrine, sealing their ritual beneath the feet of Dover's children for nearly 2 decades. Among the bones, buried deeper in the soil, lay a book wrapped in oilcloth. When opened, it revealed the final Harper ledger, its pages damp but legible. Inside were more names, more dates, written with the same ornate hand. Some entries carried marks never seen before. Patterns of circles nested within each other, as though Elias had refined his system even in exile. The names matched children remembered only in rumor, those who had vanished during storms and never been found. The pit beneath the schoolhouse confirmed what many had feared. The Harpers had not stopped their work after leaving Dover. They had only hidden it deeper, binding their silence into the very ground of the parish. What remained was not only evidence of cruelty, but proof of intention. The choir Elias dreamed of, the eternal congregation Miriam stitched into cloth, had been given its own chamber beneath a place meant for learning and light. And when the pit was filled and the bones reburied, the workers spoke of hearing a faint hum, as though the circle below had not been silenced, only sealed again. In 1832, Delaware enacted statutes unlike any the parish had known before. Schools were now required to keep daily rolls of every child, names marked with attendance and absence, each absence reported without delay. Churches, too, were ordered to maintain careful records noting baptisms, burials, and unexplained vanishings. At the time, lawmakers spoke only of recent failings in oversight, but in private circles people knew what had driven the change. The whispers of the Harper family, the unanswered vanishings, the discovery of bones and ledgers and quilted initials, all of it had pressed the state toward a law meant to bind silence before it could grow again. Historians later traced the shift directly back to Dover. They found petitions written in cautious hands, letters from townsfolk who never dared to name Elias or Miriam outright but spoke of neighbors who sheltered strangers that were never seen again, and of children whose voices were silenced without record. Nowhere in the statute's language did the Harper name appear. Officially, the family did not exist in law, but unofficially everyone understood that the regulations were written in their shadow. The state had moved to ensure no ledger could ever stand in place of a child's true life again. By then, the Harpers themselves were gone. No graves bore their names, no parish register listed their deaths. Some said they fled westward under new names, carrying their habits into silence. Others swore they died in the marsh, swallowed by the very land they had used as their cover. What remained were fragments, quilts folded into trunks, bones unearthed beneath rotted timbers, and the ledgers locked away in state archives. Those books, damp and warped, still bore the ornate handwriting of Elias Harper, each name curling with ceremonial weight, each page a testimony to children who never lived beyond his design. Visitors who later viewed the ledgers behind glass said the ink had not fully faded. Some letters gleamed as if freshly written, refusing to die even as the paper crumbled. Archivists noted that the books were often found slightly ajar in their cases, as though opened by unseen hands. For many, the ledgers became more than relics. They were warnings, proof of how easily a family could twist ordinary trust into ritualized horror. The Harpers themselves had vanished, leaving no stone to mark their place, but their records endured. Binding the state to laws meant to guard against silence. In that way, the family who built their legacy on children that never existed ensured that their shadow would linger in every roll call, every baptismal page, every report of absence yet to come. The ledgers that remain are fragile now, their pages curled and yellowed with damp, but the names inside still carry a weight that paper should not be able to hold. Dozens of them written in the ornate hand of Elias Harper, some belonging to children who truly lived for a time, others to those who never walked the earth outside his imagination. Together they form a congregation of the silenced, a choir that never sang freely, bound forever in ink. To open the ledger is to see not only names but intent, the deliberate act of claiming lives that ended in silence. It is tempting to look for monsters in such stories, to imagine evil as something that reveals itself with snarls or blood-stained hands. But the Harpers were never monsters in the eyes of their neighbors. They were generous, soft-spoken, quick with scripture, steady with work. They stitched quilts admired at market. They sang hymns in church. They opened their doors to those in need. The horror lay not in horns or shadows, but in the ordinary faces that smiled while concealing rituals of cruelty. Evil here was not loud. It was methodical, disciplined, patient, hiding in ledgers, in fabric patterns, in songs carried across the marsh at night. What endures most is not the spectacle of fire or trial, but the quiet permanence of the records. Ink that outlived flesh, thread that preserved initials longer than graves. Names that continued long after voices had been erased. The Harpers proved that evil does not need to shout to last. It only needs to be written down, preserved in forms no one questions, carried forward by those too fearful to accuse. As the documentary closes, we are left with a final unease. The Harpers vanished, their house gone, their barn reduced to ash. Yet their work endures in pages stored under glass, in laws passed to protect children, in whispers that still circle the marsh where their home once stood. The question is not whether their evil was real. The bones and ledgers prove it was. The question is whether such silence could take root again, behind another ordinary door in another trusting town. What do you think? Could this happen again?